The year was 1887, and the sun over the Texas panhandle was a merciless hammer. It beat down on the raw, dusty street of Redemption, a town that had chosen its name with an irony no one seemed to notice. In the center of that street, on a crude platform of splintered planks, stood a woman. Her name was Esther, though no one had used it in so long it felt like a ghost on her tongue. Around her neck, a rope held a rough-hewn sign against the thin fabric of her dress. The letters were smeared and cruel. Damaged goods. She kept her eyes fixed on the warped boards beneath her bare feet. To look up was to drown in a sea of faces twisted with contempt, with avarice, with a morbid curiosity that was somehow the worst of all. She could feel their judgment like a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, adding to the burden of memory she already carried. She had been passed from one misfortune to another until she landed here, the final, humiliating destination. An auction, not of livestock or property, but of a life deemed worthless. The auctioneer, a man with a sweat-stained hat and a voice like gravel, was extolling her virtues with a salesman's leer. "Strong back," he barked. "Still young enough. Quiet, too. Won't give a man no trouble." He conveniently omitted the reasons for the sign, leaving it to the grubby imaginations of the crowd. Esther's stasis was absolute. It was not the quiet routine of a lonely life, but the frozen stillness of a creature trapped, waiting for the killing blow. Her body was a prison of scars, both visible and unseen. A long, puckered burn marred the skin from her left wrist to her elbow, a permanent reminder of a fire she had barely escaped. Other, older marks littered her back, legacies of a brutal man she had once called husband. But the deepest wounds were etched inside, where no one could see them. They were the source of the hollowness in her eyes, the rigid set of her jaw. She had built a wall of silence around herself, a fortress no one had ever tried to breach. They only ever wanted to break what was left. A few bids came, low and mocking. A rancher known for his cruelty, Garrett Shaw, offered a pittance, his eyes roaming over her with an owner's possessive glare. A saloon owner made a counteroffer, his intentions just as vile, if not more public. The air grew thick with their vile contest, each bid a new nail in her coffin. Esther braced herself, her spirit recoiling to a small, hard point deep within her, a place she prayed they could not reach. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would simply endure, as she had always done. Then a different voice cut through the grime of the bidding. It was calm, clear, and utterly out of place. $100. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of murmurs. Heads turned, searching for the source of such an exorbitant sum. Esther risked a glance, her eyes lifting from the safety of the floorboards. A man stood at the edge of the crowd, distinct from the dusty, weathered men around him. He was tall and wore a dark, respectable coat, despite the oppressive heat. His face was clean-shaven, his features sharp and intelligent, and his eyes, they were not filled with lust or contempt. They were filled with a quiet, unnerving intensity, the look of a man assessing a problem. He looked directly at her, not as a piece of merchandise, but as if seeing the person shackled to the sign. Garrett Shaw spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust. "What's a man like you want with her, Doc? She's broken." The man, Dr. Arthur Vance, did not turn to acknowledge Shaw. His focus remained on the auctioneer. $100, he repeated, his voice unwavering. "Is that the winning bid, or shall we continue this spectacle?" The auctioneer, stunned into a rare silence, looked from the doctor to Shaw. Shaw scowled, his pride stung, but $100 was a fortune for a woman no one else wanted. He grumbled something under his breath and stepped back, defeated. The saloon owner had already faded back into the crowd. No one else dared to bid against the town's physician. "Sold," the auctioneer finally croaked, slamming his gavel down onto a barrelhead. "To Dr. Vance for $100. The transaction was completed with a cold, swift finality. Money exchanged hands. The rope holding the sign was cut from her neck, and it fell into the dust. Another rope, this one binding her wrists, was untied by the doctor himself. His fingers were clinical and detached as they worked the knot, his touch surprisingly gentle. He did not speak to her. He simply gestured for her to step down from the platform. As Esther's feet touched the solid ground, the world tilted precariously. She had been bought. Her fate had changed hands, but whether for better or worse was a terrifying, unanswered question. She followed the doctors retreating back through the parting crowd, the whispers of the townspeople like the rustling of snakes in dry grass behind her. His silence was as unnerving as the shouts had been, a new kind of prison whose walls she could not yet see. Dr. Arthur Vance's home was at the quiet end of the main street, a clean, two-story wooden building with a small sign that read, A. Vance, physician and surgeon. It was a structure of order and purpose in a town that seemed to have neither. He led her not through the front door of the clinic, but around to a private entrance at the side. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of carbolic acid and dried herbs, a scent so different from the dust and sweat of the outside world that it made her dizzy. He showed her into a small, immaculately clean room at the back of the house. It contained a simple cot with a neatly folded quilt, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single window that looked out onto an empty yard where a few medicinal plants struggled against the arid soil. "You can stay here," he said, his voice as neutral as his expression. He placed a bundle of folded cloth on the cot. "These are clean clothes. There is stew on the stove in the kitchen. Eat when you are hungry. The door does not have a lock from the outside." The last sentence hung in the air between them. It was a statement of fact, but it felt like a declaration, a first, tentative offering of trust in a world that had taught her trust was a fool's currency. Esther said nothing. She couldn't. Her voice was a rusted thing, trapped in her throat. She only nodded, a tiny, jerky movement, her eyes cast downward. She listened to his footsteps retreat down the hall, the quiet click of a door closing. Alone, she finally allowed her body to tremble, the terror and confusion of the day washing over her in a silent, shuddering wave. She was safe from Garrett Shaw, but what did this new man want? Kindness without a price was a language she did not understand. For 2 days, they existed in a state of near-perfect silence. Esther remained in her room, emerging only when she was sure he was occupied in the front clinic or had gone out. She ate the food he left for her, washed with the water he provided, and wore the simple grey dress he had given her. It was the softest fabric that had touched her skin in years. She observed him from the shadows of the hallway, a ghost in her new gilded cage. He was a man of quiet, meticulous routine. He rose early, worked in his clinic with a steady stream of patients, a child with a fever, a cowboy with a broken arm, an old woman with a coffin, spent his evenings reading by the light of an oil lamp in his study. He never tried to speak to her beyond a quiet, "good evening," if they happened to pass in the hall. He never approached her room, he simply left her be, allowing her the space to breathe. On the 3rd evening, he broke the fragile truce of silence. She was washing her plate in the kitchen when he entered. She froze, her hands submerged in the soapy water, her back rigid. "Esther," he said. Her name. He had learned her name. It sounded strange and foreign in the quiet room. She did not turn. "The sign they put on you. It said you were damaged." Her knuckles went white as she gripped the edge of the basin. This was it, the price. "I am a doctor," he continued, his tone measured, clinical. "Damage is my business, the physical kind at least. I would like to examine your injuries, not as your owner, but as your physician." She still did not move, her mind racing. It was a command disguised as a request, but his voice held no threat, only a calm statement of purpose. It was the voice he used with his other patients. Slowly, painfully, she turned to face him. She gave a single, reluctant nod. He led her into the clinic. The room was organized and sterile, filled with glass-stoppered bottles, polished instruments, and medical charts. He gestured to the examination table. "Please, sit, and if you are able, roll up your left sleeve." Her hands shook as she obeyed, pushing the soft grey fabric up her arm. The scar was ugly in the lamplight, a landscape of ruined skin, tight and ridged from her wrist to her elbow. It was a brand, a permanent mark of her past. She expected him to flinch, to show some sign of revulsion. Most people did. Dr. Vance did not flinch. He simply looked at it with professional detachment, his fingers gently probing the edges of the scarred tissue. "An old burn," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Badly healed. The contracture must limit your movement." She hadn't realized until he said it how much she favored that arm, how she instinctively avoided stretching it fully. "There are salves that can soften the tissue," he said, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment, "and exercises to improve the range of motion. It will not erase the scar, but it can make it quieter." Quieter. It was an odd word to use for a scar, but it resonated with a truth she had never been able to articulate. Her scars were loud. They screamed her history to the world. "You're back," he said softly, his gaze dropping for a moment before returning to her face. "The auctioneer mentioned a strong back. May I?" This was a far greater test. This required a deeper level of vulnerability. She hesitated, her entire body tensing, but his eyes held no judgment, only a quiet patience. She saw the doctor, not the man who had bought her. Taking a shuddering breath, she turned her back to him and, with trembling fingers, unbuttoned the top of her dress, letting it fall just enough to expose her shoulders and the lattice-work of pale, silvery lines that crisscrossed her skin. She heard him draw in a soft breath. It was not a gasp of horror, but a quiet, controlled intake of air. He did not touch her this time. He just stood there for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick with things unsaid. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She was a ruin, a landscape of damage. "These are old wounds," he said, his voice softer now, less clinical. "Very old. They have already healed as much as they are able." He paused. "The body is resilient. It does what it can to mend." Esther pulled the dress back up, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. He stepped away, giving her space, and began mixing something in a small mortar. The rhythmic scrape and grind of the pestle filled the quiet room. "I bought you, Esther," he said, his back still to her, "because I saw a patient, not a commodity. I saw a person in need of a physician, and I happened to be one. Garrett Shaw, and men like him, they see only what is broken. They fail to see the strength it takes to survive the breaking." He turned, holding out a small ceramic pot. "This is for the burn. Apply it twice a day. It is made with comfrey and lanolin. It will help." She took the pot, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm. It was the first time she had willingly initiated contact with a man in longer than she could remember. She looked down at the pot in her hand, then up at his face. For the first time she truly looked at him. She saw the fine lines of fatigue around his eyes, the hint of a sadness he kept carefully hidden. He had his own scars, she realized. They were just better concealed. "Thank you," she whispered. The word was hoarse, fragile from disuse, but it was real. It was the first crack in the wall of silence she had built around her heart. The days that followed fell into a new, tentative rhythm. A fragile trust began to sprout in the sterile quiet of the doctor's house, as delicate and persistent as the herbs in his yard. Esther began to use the salve, dutifully massaging it into the tight, angry scar on her arm. At first, the touch was alien, a clinical act of following instructions. But slowly, it became something else. It was an act of care for herself, a reclaiming of her own damaged flesh. Arthur showed her a series of gentle stretches, movements designed to coax the scarred tissue into yielding. The pain was a dull, pulling ache, but with it came a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: progress. Their conversations remained sparse, but they were no longer punctuated by suspicion. They were islands of communication in a sea of shared silence. He would tell her about his patients, omitting names, speaking of ailments and remedies with a detached passion. She, in turn, began to emerge from her room more often. She took over the care of the kitchen, finding a simple, grounding solace in the rhythm of chopping vegetables and kneading dough. The aromas of baking bread and simmering soup began to replace the antiseptic smell of the clinic, weaving a thread of domesticity into the fabric of their lives. One evening, as he sat reading in his study, she brought him a cup of chamomile tea. She set it on the small table beside his armchair and hesitated, lingering in the doorway. He looked up from his book, a question in his eyes. "The boy who came in today," she said, her voice quiet. "The one with the croup, will he be well?" Arthur closed his book, marking his page with a finger. "I believe so. The steam from the kettle will ease his breathing. His mother is attentive. That is half the battle." He studied her for a moment. "You have a keen eye for observing." She shrugged, looking at the floor. "I just wondered." "It is good to wonder," he said gently. "It means you have not forgotten how to care." It was in these small moments that the layers of her past began to peel away. He never asked her about the fire or the man who had left the scars on her back. He seemed to understand that a direct question would be a violation, sending her scurrying back into her shell. Instead, he created a space where the memories could surface on their own terms. He gave her a book to read one day, a worn copy of Jane Eyre. She lost herself in the story of another woman who had suffered, who had been deemed plain and insignificant, but who possessed an unshakable inner fire. Reading it, Esther felt a kinship, a flicker of her own dormant spirit. Arthur, too, began to reveal parts of himself, not in grand confessions, but in small, unguarded fragments. She learned that he had come from the East, from a life of professional respect and comfort in Boston. She learned that he played the violin, though the instrument sat in its case in the corner of his study, collecting dust. One night, while cleaning, she found a small framed daguerreotype tucked away in a drawer. It showed a smiling young woman with Arthur's eyes, holding a small baby. The grief that radiated from the forgotten object was a palpable thing. It was a wound he kept hidden far more deeply than her scars. She placed the photograph back in the drawer and closed it gently, a profound and sorrowful understanding dawning on her. He was a healer who could not heal himself. He had come to this desolate edge of the world not to escape his past, but to bury himself in the work of mending others, perhaps because he could not mend the gaping hole in his own life. His kindness to her was not charity. It was an act of empathy from one wounded soul to another. He saw her damage because he was intimately acquainted with his own. The shifting perception was mutual. She no longer saw him as her buyer or even just her doctor. She saw Arthur, the man who read medical journals with fierce concentration, who spoke softly to frightened children, who carried a vast and silent sorrow. And he, in turn, began to see past the scars and the silence to the woman beneath. He saw the intelligence in her eyes when she listened, the quiet competence in her hands as she worked, the fierce resilience that had allowed her to survive unspeakable things. The sign that had defined her damaged goods was becoming a lie. She was not damaged, she was a survivor. This fragile piece, however, was a bubble, and the town of redemption was a pin poised to burst it. Their arrangement was a source of endless, prurient speculation. Whispers followed Arthur when he walked down the street. Women would cross to the other side to avoid him, their faces pinched with moral superiority. They called Esther his whore, his pet project, a stain on the town's already questionable decency. Garrett Shaw was the loudest voice in the chorus of condemnation. He had been publicly bested and humiliated by the doctor, and his bruised pride festered like an untended wound. He saw Arthur's quiet compassion as weakness and Esther's presence in the doctor's house as an affront to his own thwarted desires. He and his cronies would stand across the street from the clinic, their glares like poisoned darts. "Look at him, playing saint with his broken toy," Shaw would sneer, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Thinks he's better than us, with his books and his fancy words. But he's no different. He bought her, same as I would have, just paid a prettier price." The hostility began to escalate from words to actions. A rock shattered the clinic window one night, landing on the floor with a spray of glass. On it was tied a crude note, "Get the harlot out." Arthur swept up the glass with a grim, tight-lipped expression, his jaw clenched. Esther watched him, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She was the cause of this. She was bringing trouble to the one person who had shown her kindness. "I should go," she said that night, her voice barely a whisper. "I can find work somewhere else. I will not bring this down on you." Arthur stopped his sweeping and looked at her, his eyes dark with an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was not anger at her, but at the town, at the injustice of it all. "And where would you go, Esther? Back to men like Shaw? Back to another auction block?" He shook his head, his voice low and fierce. "This is your home now. I will not have you driven out by the ignorance of small-minded men. This is my fight as much as it is yours." His words were a shield, and for the first time she felt what it was like to be defended. But the fear remained. The town's prejudice was a relentless, creeping tide, and she worried it would eventually erode the foundation of the sanctuary he had built for her. Shaw was not a man to be satisfied with broken windows. He wanted to break people, and she knew with a chilling certainty that he was not finished with her yet. The quiet life they had cultivated was about to be plunged into a violent storm. The storm broke on a Tuesday. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue, and the air was thick with the promise of another scorching afternoon. Arthur had been called out to the McBride Ranch, miles from town, to deliver twins. He had been gone since dawn. Esther was alone in the house, kneading bread in the kitchen, the familiar motion, a small comfort against the hum of anxiety that had become her constant companion. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the porch of the clinic, followed by a violent rattling of the locked front door. It wasn't the sound of a patient in need, it was the sound of impatience, of aggression. Her hands froze in the dough. "Doc," Garrett Shaw's voice boomed through the door. "We know you're in there with her. Open up." Esther's blood ran cold. She flattened herself against the kitchen wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear the murmurs of other men with him. They had waited until Arthur was gone. They had come for her. A loud crack echoed through the house as the wood of the door frame splintered. They were breaking in. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Her first instinct was to run, to hide in her room like a frightened animal. But then, an image flashed in her mind. Arthur's face, his expression of grim resolve as he swept up the broken glass. "This is your home now." No, she would not hide. This was her home, and these men would not defile it. A surge of defiant energy, born of desperation and a flicker of newfound self-worth, propelled her into action. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes darting, searching. Not for a weapon of violence, but for a tool of defense. Her gaze landed on the large, heavy pot of water simmering on the stove, steam ghosting from its surface. It was for boiling bandages, for sterilization, for healing. Today, it would be for something else. The clinic door burst open with a crash, and Shaw swaggered in, two of his ranch hands flanking him. His eyes were alight with a cruel, triumphant fire. "There she is," he sneered, his gaze sweeping over her. All alone, the good doctor left his little pet unguarded. He started toward the hallway that led to the kitchen. "We've come to collect what's mine by rights, girl. I made the first bid. You belong to me." Esther stood in the kitchen doorway, her body trembling, but her resolve a rod of steel in her spine. As Shaw stepped into the hall, she acted. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she lifted the heavy pot of scalding water from the stove. "Get out of this house," she said, her voice clear and ringing, louder than she had ever heard it. It was the voice of the woman from the book, the woman with the inner fire. Shaw laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Put that down before you hurt yourself, little girl." He took another step. That was his mistake. With a desperate cry, she heaved the pot forward, sending a great sloshing wave of boiling water onto the floorboards directly in front of him. The scalding liquid hissed and steamed, creating an impassable, steaming barrier. Shaw leaped back with a yelp, barely avoiding a serious burn, his boots soaked. His ranch hands stared, their bravado vanishing in the face of such unexpected ferocity. "I said, get out," Esther screamed, her voice cracking with the strain, her arm aching from the weight of the pot she still held. The standoff was broken by the sound of a horse galloping hard, pulling up sharply outside. A moment later, Arthur Vance filled the broken doorway, his bag still in his hand, his face a mask of thunder. He had clearly seen the situation from the road and returned at a full gallop. He took in the scene in an instant, the shattered door, Shaw and his men, and Esther standing like a cornered Valkyrie, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "Shaw," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low, "what is the meaning of this?" Garrett Shaw, his boots dripping, tried to recover his bluster. "This ain't your concern, Doc. This is between me and her." "Everything in this house is my concern," Arthur shot back, stepping inside. He placed himself squarely between Shaw and the hallway where Esther stood. "And this woman is under my protection. You will leave my property now, or I will ensure that the sheriff in the next county hears about you breaking into a doctor's home and threatening his assistant." The word hung in the air, a deliberate public declaration, not his property, not his patient, his assistant. It conferred a status, a legitimacy that infuriated Shaw. He looked from the doctor's unyielding face to Esther's fierce defiance and finally to his unnerved men. He had lost control of the situation. Beaten back by a woman with a cooking pot and faced down by a doctor who seemed to have no fear of him. With a venomous curse, Shaw turned on his heel. "This ain't over," he snarled over his shoulder, but the threat was hollow. He had been publicly shamed again, and this time there was no recovering. He and his men stomped out, leaving a trail of muddy water and the wreckage of the door behind them. The silence that descended was profound. The only sounds were Esther's ragged breathing and the drip of water from Shaw's retreat. Arthur walked slowly down the hall until he stood before her. She was still holding the heavy pot, her arms shaking from the effort. Gently he reached out and took the pot from her hands, setting it on the floor. His eyes searched her face, filled with a mixture of awe and overwhelming relief. He saw no fear there now, only the trembling aftershocks of courage. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft. She could only nod, the words not yet ready to come. He reached out then, not as a doctor, but as a man. He cupped her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. It was a gesture of such profound tenderness and respect that it broke through the last of her defenses. "You were magnificent," he whispered. And in the quiet of the vandalized house, surrounded by the smell of steam and wet wood, Esther finally understood. He hadn't just healed her scars, he had given her the strength to defend them. He hadn't bought her freedom, but had provided the sanctuary in which she could find it for herself. The auction block was a lifetime away. She was no longer damaged goods, she was home. In the days that followed the confrontation, a new quiet settled over the house, but it was different from the silence of before. It was not the silence of caution and unspoken fears, but the peaceful, breathing silence of shared understanding. The broken door was repaired, its new wood a testament to the boundary they had defended together. The town, having witnessed Shaw's public defeat and the doctor's unshakable resolve, began to retreat. The whispers did not cease entirely, but they grew fainter, their venom diluted by a grudging respect. People began to see what Arthur had declared so forcefully. Esther was not his chattel, but his assistant, a part of the clinic, a part of his life. Their relationship settled into a new equilibrium, an unspoken partnership that was as solid and real as the floorboards beneath their feet. Esther truly did become his assistant. She had a natural aptitude for the work, a steady hand, and a deep, intuitive empathy for the suffering of others. She learned to clean and dress wounds, to mix herbal remedies, to comfort the fearful. The patients, who had once eyed her with suspicion, began to accept her presence, then to rely on it. They saw the quiet competence with which she worked, the gentle way she had with a feverish child or an anxious elder. They began to see her not as the woman from the auction block, but as an extension of the doctor's own healing hands. Her own healing continued, blossoming in this new soil of purpose and acceptance. The scar on her arm, softened by the daily application of the salve, became less a brand of shame and more a part of her own topography, a map of where she had been. Her smile, once a rare and fragile thing, appeared more often, illuminating her face with a light Arthur had never seen. The fortress of silence crumbled completely, replaced by conversation, by shared thoughts, and sometimes by shared laughter, a sound so unexpected and lovely it made Arthur's heart ache in the best possible way. One cool evening, as autumn began to lay its gentle hand on the harsh landscape, Arthur took the violin from its case. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as he lifted it to his chin. He had not played since before his wife and child had been taken by influenza, back in Boston. The instrument was tied to a grief so profound he thought it had silenced all the music in him forever. He drew the bow across the strings, and a hesitant, mournful melody filled the study. It was rusty and out of tune, the sound of a voice long unused. Esther, who was reading in a chair across the room, looked up. She did not speak, but simply listened, her eyes soft and understanding. He played on, the notes growing stronger, clearer, as his fingers remembered their old grace. He played a somber lament, a piece that poured out all the sorrow he had kept locked away. And as he played, he felt something shift within him, a great frozen sea of grief beginning to thaw. He was not just playing for the family he had lost, he was playing for the companion he had found. When the last note faded, the silence that returned was filled with a deep, resonant emotion. Arthur lowered the violin, his gaze meeting Esther's across the room. In her eyes he saw his own sorrow reflected, but also something more, a shared understanding of loss and a shared testament to the resilience of the human heart. "I haven't played that in a long time," he said, his voice thick. "It was beautiful," she replied softly, "sad, but beautiful." In that moment, the last vestiges of their former roles buyer and bought, doctor and patient, dissolved into nothing. They were simply Arthur and Esther, two solitary souls who had found in each other an anchor in a turbulent world. They had healed each other, not by erasing the scars of the past, but by creating a present in which those scars no longer had the power to define them. Their life became a quiet tapestry woven from the threads of their daily work and their shared home. The house was no longer just a clinic with rooms attached. It was a sanctuary, a place of peace. The future was no longer a terrifying void, but a path that stretched out before them, a path they would walk together. The nature of their bond was never spoken aloud, for it did not need a name. It was deeper than passion, quieter than romance. It was a profound connection forged in the crucible of shared pain and cemented by mutual respect and a deep, abiding care. One afternoon, standing at the window that looked out onto the small herb garden, Esther watched Arthur showing a young boy how to properly splint the wing of an injured bird. The sun caught the silver in Arthur's hair, and his face, usually so serious, was gentle with concentration. A sense of peace, so complete and profound it felt like a physical warmth, settled over her. She ran her hand over the scar on her arm. The skin was smoother now, the tightness gone. It was just a mark, a reminder that to be damaged was not to be destroyed. It was a reminder that even after the fire, it was possible to feel the sun again, and to find, in the most unlikely of places, a reason to grow toward its light.